Hello, my dear students. This is again Teacher Jenny guiding you on the second module for quarter 4 of Mathematics 7 with the topic Collection of Data. At the end of this video, you are expected to gather statistical data. But before that, last time we had discussed on the difference between population and sample. Let us recall what we have learned. Given the situation, the school librarian wants to find out the number of books each student reads. She asks the students in the library on the number of books they have read in the previous week. Now, based on the given situation, what is the population? Very good. All students in the school. So when we say population, we are dealing with the entire group under observation or under study. What about the sample? You're right. These are the students in the library. So the sample is just taken from the population. So if you are the researcher, how are you going to choose the sample from the given population? If you do not know the answer, don't worry because that will be our lesson for today. So for our first lesson, we have the different sampling techniques. So these are the different ways finding the sample out of a given population. First sampling technique is the random sampling. When we say random sampling, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. The members of the sample are chosen independently of each other. So for the random sampling, there is no bias in the process of selecting the sample, because each member of the population has an equal chance of being chosen. An example here is this one. So say for example, we have 20 members of our population. Using random sampling, we can choose any 5. So we can have these members. One best example of this random sampling is writing the names of the members of the population in pieces of papers and then rolling these papers, put them inside a box or a hat. Then, without looking at the names written on those pieces of papers, you're going to then pick the needed number of sample. Now, aside from manual selecting of the sample in random sampling, there are also new discovered applications on selecting samples from a given population, one of which is the hat. So on this application, we simply have to input first all the names of the members of the population. And then after that, click the hat on the menu bar and then draw names. So since we have to take a sample of 5 from 20 individuals, we have to draw 5 names. So we have Brando. Next we have Angel. Then we have May. Fourth we have Mark. And last we have Tanya. So as you can see, we now have here 5 samples from our population. And take note, there is no bias in drawing these names because this is auto-generated from the application called the hat. So that's the first sampling technique. We have the random sampling. Another sampling technique is what we call the convenience sampling. From the name itself, it simply includes the individuals who happen to be most accessible to the researcher or those who are easier to. So from the name itself, it simply includes the individuals who happen to be most accessible to the researcher. Let us have an example. So again, we have here the 20 members of our population. Using the convenience sampling, you can simply choose 5 samples out of the 20 members of the population by simply taking the first 5 on the list. So take note, that's convenience sampling. Another sampling technique is stratified sampling. The population here is divided into subgroups so that each population member is in only one subgroup. So for stratified sampling, we have to create subgroups first. Then we have to select samples from each subgroups. So the samples should well represent each subgroups. Examples. We have here 8 males and 12 females on the population. So if you're going to select 5 samples from the population, we can have 2 from the set of males and 3 from the set of females. So we can have these 2 from the set of males and these 3 from the set of females. So take note, the samples will represent each subgroups. Next, we have cluster sampling. In here, we divide the population into subgroups, then randomly select entire subgroup or subgroups. So in here, we have to divide the population into subgroups like stratified sampling, but in here, we have to randomly select entire subgroup or subgroups. So both cluster sampling and stratified sampling needs the population to be divided into subgroups. But the only difference is that for stratified sampling, we have to select samples from each subgroup. But for this cluster sampling, we have to select the entire subgroup or subgroups. Example, we have here again 20 members of the population grouped into 5. So if we're going to take 4 people for our sample, we simply have to choose one subgroup. So say for example, we take this one. So that is how to select a sample using cluster sampling. Dividing the population into subgroups and then selecting entire subgroup or subgroups. If we need 8 members for our sample, then we can choose 2 groups. The last sampling technique is what we call the systematic sampling. So in here, every member of the population is listed with the number which are chosen at regular intervals. So we have to assign numbers to every member of the population and then select one number and then use that number interval to select the other members of the sample. So if, say for example, again, we have here the 20 members of the population, then if we're going to select 5 samples, 20 divided by 5, that is 4. Then from 1 to 4, let's say we selected 2. So from the second individual, we have to take the next 4th individual. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we have this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have this one. And of course, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have this one. So we now have here 5 samples. So that is an example of choosing a sample using systematic sampling. Let us have more examples. We have this situation. A mathematics teacher plans to choose 5 students from a class of 25 students to join the robotics contest. How could the teacher choose the 5 students? Using random sampling, we can have this one. Names of students were written in a piece of paper, rolled, and put inside a box. Without looking at the written names, the teacher picks 5 pieces of paper. So that is an example of random sampling. There is no bias. All the members of the population have an equal chance of being selected. Using the same situation, let's have convenience sampling. In here, the teacher chooses 5 students closest to her or closest to the teacher's table. Those 5 students closest to her could be more convenient. Next, we have stratified sampling. So to do this, the teacher divides the class into 5 groups according to their talents, then chooses one member from each group. So again, for stratified sampling, we have to divide the population into subgroups and then make sure that each subgroup is well represented. Another sampling technique is the cluster sampling. In here, the teacher divides the class into 5 groups according to their favorite subject, then chooses one of those 5 groups. So take note, for cluster sampling, we have to create again subgroups and then choose one of those subgroups to represent the whole population. And then, of course, we have the systematic sampling. In here, the teacher assigns numbers to each student, then picks a number from 1 to 5. The chosen number is the basis in selecting the next 4 student numbers. So there is a systematic way of choosing the sample, and that is by choosing samples from the choosing a number of the samples at regular intervals. So those are the 5 sampling techniques. Now let's proceed to our second lesson. We have the different methods of collecting data. First, we have interview. This method is referred to as the direct method of gathering data because it requires direct conversation with the respondent or respondents. So in here, we have to make a one-on-one conversation with the respondent in order for us to collect the needed data. And in an interview, the interviewer is the person gathering the data or the person who conducts the interview. And the interviewee is the person supplying the data or the one who is answering questions in an interview. Example, The researcher would like to know the reaction of students on the conducted earthquake drill. So, of course, since the researcher is after the reaction of the students, which can only be known by having a one-on-one conversation with the respondents, then the researcher needs to conduct an interview. Next method of collecting data is through questionnaires. This method is referred to as indirect method of gathering data because this makes use of written questions to be answered by the respondent. So indirect, since we need another medium of throwing question and giving an answer, and that is through the use of pen and paper. So in here, instead of asking the questions through one-on-one conversation, the researcher simply have to encode and print the questions, then let the respondents answer them on the printed material. Example: the researcher would like to know the favorite snacks of grade 7 students in the school. So since in here, the researcher only needs to know the favorite snacks of the grade 7 students, no more detailed or thorough discussion of the topic is needed, then the researcher can just float a questionnaire. Another way of collecting data is observation. This method makes use of the different human senses in gathering information. This is most applicable when we are dealing with the behavior of our respondents. So in an observation, the investigator is the person who gathers the data, and the subject is the person being observed. So the investigator here is the researcher and the subject is the respondents. Example: the researcher would like to know the changes in behavior of students from attending online class to attending face-to-face classes. So take note, in this example, we have to consider the changes in behavior of the students. That's why the best way to collect or gather data here is through observation. Another method of collecting data is registration or census. This method requires the enactment of law to take effect because it needs the participation of a large, if not the entire population. So this method is applicable if there is a large set of respondents or we are considering the entire population. An example here is the researcher would like to know the number of children per household in a particular barangay. So since a barangay has many households, then we have a large set of data. That's why we have to use here registration or census. The last method of collecting data is through experimentation. This method is usually conducted in laboratories where specimens are subjected to some aspects of control to find out cause and effect relations. So, we use this experimentation to gather data, especially when we need to study something in a laboratory. An example here is the researcher would like to test the level of efficacy of new COVID-19 vaccine using monkeys and other animals. So in here, the researcher needs to take the study inside a laboratory, then it is through experimentation. So those are the 5 methods in collecting data. So before we end this video, Remember that there are 5 sampling techniques. We have the random sampling, the convenience sampling, the stratified sampling, the cluster sampling, and the systematic sampling. And there are 5 methods of collecting data. First, we have the interview. Next, questionnaire. Third, observation. Fourth, registration or census. And last, experimentation. Do you have questions? If you have, type them on the comment section. That ends now our tutorial video. I hope you have learned a lot from this video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.